Welcome back. Last time we finished our discussion of the final discourse of Jesus in the Gospel of John. We looked particularly at the instructions that Jesus gave to his disciples for when he had returned to the Father, and his preview of what they could expect. Finally, we join Jesus and the disciples in the great high priestly prayer that forms the link between the discourse and the passion narrative. In our current session, we will look at the final hours of Jesus as they are portrayed in the Johannine Passion narrative. In particular, we'll accompany Jesus and his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he will be arrested. Then we shall look at the hearing before the high priest, Annas, which also contains a narrative of Peter's denial. Since all sentences of death must be handed down by a Roman court, we'll move to the court of Pilate and look at the encounter between Jesus and Pilate, which also contains the Barabbas scene. Here we have a map of the old city of Jerusalem, as it probably was in Jesus' day. On the far right, toward the top, we find the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was arrested. From there, he was taken to the home of the high priest, which is labeled the house of Caiphas. It's located toward the bottom of the map, near the center. The Jewish hearing and Peter's denial take place at this location. After the hearing before the high priest, Jesus was led to the Praetorium, which is the residence of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, in Jerusalem. It was generally accepted that this was in the fortress Antonia, located toward the top of the Temple Mount. But recently, some scholars have held that Pilate's residence was the old Hasmonean Palace, which is located directly in the center of the map. At the Praetorium, Pilate questions Jesus, and after failing to persuade the Jewish crowd, condemns him to death. So at the Praetorium, the way of the cross begins. And given the two possibilities for the residence of Pilate, there are two possible routes to Calvary. The more traditional one is the one beginning at the fortress Antonia. Finally, at the end of the way of the cross, Jesus reaches the place of crucifixion, Calvary or Golgotha. After his death, he's buried in the tomb adjacent to Golgotha. The site of the Garden of Gethsemane is marked by a church built in 1924 under the watchful eye of the architect Antonio Berluzzi. Here we see the church as one looks down from the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. Next to the church is the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was arrested. Here we see a rather ancient tree in the garden. The facade of the church is quite striking, designed by Giulio Bergolini. It's a golden mosaic depicting Jesus as mediator between God and man. The Latin inscription below the mosaic is taken from Hebrews. Offering prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears, he was heard for his godly fear. Hebrews 5:7. Inside the church, one is drawn immediately to the giant rock that's located in front of the altar. Jesus is said to have prayed at this rock before his arrest. Above the altar is a mosaic of Jesus in the garden, with the angel ministering to him as depicted in the Gospel of Luke. John's text begins with the disciples and Jesus on their way from the site of the Last Supper to Gethsemane, which is located across the Kidron Valley. In John, the arrest takes place almost immediately after they arrive in the garden. There's no scene with Jesus praying to the Father to remove the cup as there was in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That will be somewhat out of character for Jesus as John portrays him as the shepherd who willingly lays down his life for his sheep. That type of prayer was dealt with in the 12th chapter of the Gospel, before the Last Supper began. So Judas appears with soldiers and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Raymond Brown sees the soldiers as being part of the army of Pilate, and thus Pilate was in on the arrest of Jesus from the beginning. It's a work of both the Romans and the Jewish authorities. They're said to come with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus initiates the conversation with a question, very similar to the one asked of the disciples of John the Baptist, who came to follow him in chapter 1. Whom do you seek? They respond, Jesus of Nazareth, to which Jesus promptly announces, I am he, ego eimi in Greek. The response of the arrest party is curious. They draw back, fall to the ground. The editor is making a subtle statement here. The Greek ego eimi carries an overtone of the divine name of God as it was revealed to Moses in Exodus 3. So when Jesus simply affirms that he's the one they're looking for, they respond with a regular reaction to divine revelation, which Schnackenberg notes, quote, conveys the powerlessness of Jesus' enemies when confronted with the power of God. At the very beginning of the narrative, we get a glimpse of what the end will be. So Jesus repeats the question, to which they again answer, Jesus of Nazareth. So Jesus adds, if I'm the one you want, let these go. Then the editor shows that this was to fulfill a promise that was made earlier in the Gospel, chapter 6, verse 39, that none of those whom the Father had given him would be lost. But also this continues to show Jesus as in charge. In the narratives of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples flee at the arrest. Here they're dismissed. They go with Jesus' blessing. Then Peter acts. He has a sword with him, which he draws and strikes one of the servants of the high priest who was in the arrest party, cutting off his right ear. Now John gives us a bit more information than the others, adding that the servant's name was Malchus. Again, Jesus, being in charge, has no need of Peter defending him, and so he tells him to put away his sword, put it back into its sheath. As we have said on several occasions, what is about to unfold is necessary. Now, he reiterates, shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? So the soldiers then seized Jesus, bound him, and led him to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiphas, who was high priest that year. John is unique in having Jesus led to Annas. Annas had been a high priest from 4 to 6 A.D. of the Common Era. From that point on, either a son or a son-in-law of Annas was high priest until the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era. Then the author includes a parenthesis concerning Caiphas and a statement that he had made that was recorded in chapter 11 of the Gospel regarding the raising of Lazarus. It was Caiphas who had given the counsel to the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die for the people. Here we have a picture of the palace of Caiphas as it was conceived in the model of Jerusalem which we've cited before. The text at the end of the scene specifies that they took Jesus to the high priest's house, as they do in the other Gospels. Connected with the interrogation of Jesus by Annas in John, we have the denial of Peter, which in the other Gospels is connected to the Sanhedrin trial at the house of the high priest. Hence, the site of the house today is commemorated in the church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. Gallicantu is a Latin form for cockcrow, which was the point at which Peter realized what he had done. In the crypt church, there are 3 paintings connected with Peter. The first is the denial, where upon being asked by a slave girl in the courtyard whether he was with Jesus, Peter emphatically denies, "I do not know the man." Non novi illum, as the Latin in the picture records. The narrative immediately turns to Peter and another disciple who are following the arrest party. We're told that the other disciple was known to the high priest. Since only one other disciple appears in the narrative, that is, the beloved disciple at the foot of the cross, it's presumed that this other disciple is the beloved disciple. This disciple is able to enter the courtyard as the arrest party enters. Peter, however, is left standing at the entrance until the beloved disciple can vouch for him and he's allowed in. That sets up the first denial. The maidservant who kept the door recognizes Peter and says, "Are you not one of this man's disciples?" Peter emphatically denies it. No. This is his first denial. The scene ends with a note that the servants and the officers of the high priests were warming themselves by a fire, since it was chilly. Peter and the beloved disciple, presumably, were also with them warming themselves. The scene switches to the interior of the high priest's house, where Annas is questioning Jesus concerning his disciples and his teaching. Jesus' response points up the fact that Annas is not following proper procedure in questioning Jesus. In a court inquiry among the Jews, the correct procedure was to call witnesses, not question the accused. Jesus' response is that he's always been open, speaking where the Jews come together. Nothing was secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. This response elicits a negative response from one of the officers present, who strikes Jesus, saying, "Is that any way to answer the high priest?" Jesus, without hesitation, answers asserting his rights. "If I have spoken wrongly, bear witness to the wrong. If I am right, why do you strike me?" This is very clear. Jesus points out that it's Annas who was in the wrong, not him. Then the focus shifts to the outside and Peter. Once more, he's warming himself as he was when we left him. Those with him question, "Are you not also one of his disciples?" Again, he denies it. "I am not." This is the second denial. Finally, referring to the incident of the ear in the garden, a kinsman of Malchus, the servant whose ear was severed by Peter, questions, "Did I not see you in the garden?" This is quite close to home, since it was Peter who severed the ear. Yet Peter again denies it. The third denial. and at once the cock crowed, fulfilling what Jesus had predicted at the Last Supper. From the high priest's house, Jesus is led to the Praetorium, which we have noted is the residence of the Roman governor when he's in Jerusalem. This sets up the Roman trial scene before Pontius Pilate, governor at that time. In John's Gospel, the Roman trial is significantly embellished. It is a mini-drama in itself, in 7 acts. First, Jesus and the Jewish authorities. First, the Jewish authorities bring Jesus to Pilate. Then, Pilate privately interrogates Jesus. This is followed with the result that Pilate finds no guilt in Jesus, which he announces to the leaders. But to appease them, as they are getting somewhat disorderly, Pilate orders Jesus scourged, thinking it will appease the Jews. The scourged Jesus is then brought out, only to incite the Jews more to call for his death. This leads to a second private interrogation between Pilate and Jesus. The final scene of this mini-drama is Pilate giving the Jews what they want, passing sentence on Jesus. There is interplay forced between Pilate, Jesus, and the Jews, where Pilate is being forced to jockey back and forth between Jesus, who was in the Praetorium, and the Jews who remain outside. This jockeying back and forth heightens the drama. Here are 3 pictures from the model of the city of Jerusalem, which give us a sense of where the Pilate scene occurred. The first shows the 4 towers of the fortress Antonia, which is the traditional site of Pilate's Jerusalem residence. But as I mentioned at the beginning, recently some scholars feel that that residence was the old Hasmonean palace, which is pictured here. If indeed the fortress Antonia was the site as most believe, the way of the cross would have begun with Jesus descending the steps in the upper left of this picture and walking along the wall of to the Ganath gate, where he would have exited the city heading for Golgotha. The text notes that the hearing before Pilate took place when it was already early, proi in Greek. This was one of the watches of the Roman night, which would be approximately 3 o'clock to 6 a.m. in our reckoning. Thus Pilate, as all Roman governors, would have begun his day very early, as judged by modern customs, and will have concluded it also at a fairly early hour. Then, a key point. The Jews did not enter the Praetorium, as I mentioned, so that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Thus, the Passover meal was not the night before the crucifixion, as it is in the Synoptics, but the night after or the night of the crucifixion in John. This, as I said, forces Pilate to go outside to hear their accusations. What accusation do you bring against this man? A fairly straightforward question. But it does not get a straightforward answer. They respond, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have handed him over. Thus, it's a contrary to fact condition which implies that Jesus is guilty. But cleverly, it does not help Pilate to understand what he's guilty of. They've hedged in their accusation. As a result, Pilate tells them that he does not have jurisdiction. It concerns a point of their law. So he should be judged in accord with their own law. But the Jews respond that in accord with Pilate's law, that is Roman law, they don't have the ability to execute a death sentence, which the editor notes was to fulfill what Jesus had said on several occasions about the manner of his death. Pilate tries again to see why the Jews have brought Jesus to him. He goes inside and he questions Jesus. His first question is quick and to the point. Are you the king of the Jews? This is what Pilate presumes is the charge that they're bringing against Jesus. Since the Jews will not say it outright, perhaps Jesus will. But he realizes what Pilate's after, and he answers Pilate's question in typical rabbinic style with another question. Is this your own conclusion, or have others led you to it? In essence, Jesus is asking Pilate whether he himself truly thinks that Jesus is a king, or is he merely parroting what the Jews have been saying all along? Clearly, this does not amuse Pilate. He curtly snaps back at Jesus that it was his own nation that handed him over. So what did he do? Pilate is desperately trying to establish why this hearing is taking place at all, and is getting no help from the accusers or the accused. Jesus responds calmly. Again, note that all through this, it is Jesus, not Pilate, who is in charge. This is the Johannine Passion narrative. Jesus' response, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, that I might not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this world. So Pilate feels that he's finally getting someplace. So Jesus is a king. Jesus' answer does not affirm nor deny his kingship. He then announces that the purpose of his mission is he has come to bear witness to the truth. That we have seen is the whole thrust of his mission, to reveal the Father to the Jews and bear witness to the truth. This clearly does not help Pilate, who somewhat disgustingly asks, truth, what is that? Thus ends the second scene. The third scene involves Pilate and the Jews, who are still outside his palace, the Praetorium. Pilate announces his findings. He finds no crime in Jesus. There is nothing compelling Roman law to punish Jesus in what Pilate can glean from the Jews or Jesus. Therefore, Pilate reminds the Jews that they have a custom whereby he released to them a prisoner on the occasion of the feast of Passover. Now, there is no recorded evidence of any such custom outside the biblical narratives. Why would Pilate even think of releasing a prisoner to them in the heated anti-Roman climate of Palestine? It would only be stoking the fires of hatred. So, Pilate does invoke this custom, asking the Jews, should he release to them Jesus, who was called the King of the Jews, or should he release to them Barabbas, who is described as alestes, which generally is translated as robber, one who generally deprives another of property by violent means. It's grown by implication to be a revolutionary or a terrorist. So Pilate sets a choice before the people. Will they choose Jesus, who has no political affiliations or aspirations at all, or Barabbas, the terrorist, the robber, who is dead set on overthrowing the government? Pilate has taken quite a chance in that choice. The crowd chooses Barabbas, which puts Pilate in quite a bind. He now has to release Barabbas and accept whatever damage it might do to his political career, and he has to send Jesus to the cross. But Pilate comes up with yet another way, he feels, that might turn the emotions of the crowd. He, despite the fact that he has declared that Jesus has done nothing wrong, decides to have him scourged. This is a less dramatic punishment than crucifixion. Nevertheless, it is a gruesome punishment. In the course of the scourging, the soldier charged with the actions entertain themselves, mocking the one that they're scourging. Jesus is supposed to be a king, so a king he shall be. They plait a crown of thorns to be put on his head, and they array him in a purple cloak, signs of royalty and kingship. But they're only mocking him as they kneel before him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." This is shown by their next actions, striking him with their hands and hitting him on the head, driving the thorns further and further into his head. Here we have a picture of what the crown of thorns might look like. It's plaited as a cap that covers most of the head and usually is made of rather long thorns that will penetrate. Here we have a picture of what the scourges might look like. The small steel balls at the end of the scourges are meant to inflict maximum pain. So, having punished the innocent Jesus, Pilate now parades him out before the accusing crowd, hoping to elicit some sympathy when they see the bleeding, scourged Jesus, and to show that he has found no crime in Jesus, which is rather ironic. So the people see Jesus and Pilate, and they make who makes the declaration, Ecce Homo, behold the man. Beasley Murray describes the scene as follows. Dressed in his wretched clothes that made him look more like a clown than a king, bleeding profusely, in pain and with bruised face through the additional beatings, Jesus must have looked a shocking sight, enough to horrify any who knew him. But far from persuading the people, the chief priests and the officers, they convinced the crowd to call still again for Jesus' crucifixion. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" the crowd shouts. Pilate is certain that Jesus is innocent. The Jews are convinced that Jesus is guilty of blasphemy, which is punishable by death in their law. But because of the Roman occupation, they're not able to execute such a sentence. It has to be issued and executed by a Roman official. Hence their cries to Pilate. This is a picture of what has come to be known as the Ecce Homo Arch. It is located along the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem. Murphy O'Connor tells us that the Romans had to build a ramp across a rock-cut pool known from Josephus as the Struthion. It was protected by a city gate erected by Herod Agrippa I. The central bay of the gate forms the Ecce Homo Arch, which you see in this picture. With two attempts to avoid the ultimate sentence thwarted by the increasingly angrier Jews, Pilate takes Jesus inside the Praetorium one more time to see if he can elicit anything that might alleviate this situation. In desperation, Pilate again questions Jesus. "Where are you from?" He's trying to determine Jesus' origin, but Jesus is no help to him. He stands there silently, a clear allusion to the final suffering servant canticle of Isaiah, where the servant stands silent like a lamb before his shearers, in Isaiah 53:7. So, Pilate exercises his authority as governor. You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have power over you to release you or to crucify you? Beasley Murray notes that this situation is a bit annoying to Pilate. He's not used to people refusing to answer his questions. Pilate possesses authority from the most powerful man on earth, Caesar, and represents the most powerful nation on earth, Rome. Jesus' answer shows that he realizes who Pilate is, but he's acting on an authority much more powerful than Caesar or Rome, God himself. He says, "You would have no power over me unless it was granted to you from above." And from that conclusion it follows that he who delivered you to me has the greater sin. The first referent for this would be Judas, who delivered Jesus to the Jewish leaders. But he has left the scene completely. It was the Jewish leaders who have handed Jesus over to Pilate, and collectively this may refer to them and their leader Caiphas, along with Annas, who instigated the charges against Jesus and brought him before the council, and ultimately brought him before Pilate. Pilate still wishes to release Jesus, as he sees no reason for condemning him to death. So he goes back out to the people and pleads the case. They will hear nothing of it. Instead, they point to the political ramifications of Pilate's proposed course of action. If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Why is that? Well, everyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar. Jesus claims to be a king, so they say, and as such, he becomes a rival to Caesar. Pilate, in supporting Jesus, not eliminating him, also becomes, in their minds, a rival to Caesar. This convinces Pilate, who reluctantly takes his seat on the judgment seat at the stone pavement. We're given yet another indication of the time frame. It was the preparation day of the Passover, that is, the day before. Passover hence would begin at sundown. Further, it was about the 6th hour, noon. So Pilate then announces to the Jews, "Behold your king." They will have nothing of it. He's not a king, and as such should be punished. Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him! Then, in a most amazing statement, they pledge allegiance to Caesar. They say, "We have no king but Caesar." That very statement goes against everything that they stand for. The only king in Israel is and has been God himself. Now they turn their backs on God and on Jesus, ironically the Son of God, and pledge allegiance to Caesar. Just how far would they go to get rid of Jesus? Pilate has no choice. He hands Jesus over to be crucified. The site of the Praetorium today is the convent of the Sisters of Zion, along the road known as the Via Dolorosa, or the Sorrowful Way. In the basement of the convent there is the stone pavement, which is pictured here. It is generally thought by archaeologists that this is the pavement that dates from Jesus' day, and may have been the site of the events we have just narrated. You can see markings on the stone. It's thought that this may have been a game played by the soldiers to mock their prisoners, known as the Game of the King. This picture gives a different angle on the stone pavement. Notice it's composed of rather large stones that have been placed near each other to form a floor or a road. Here we have a mosaic on the wall of the basement of the convent depicting Jesus receiving his cross at the beginning of the Way of the Cross, the Via Dolorosa. They, the soldiers in the execution party, took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross. Two things are significant here. First, Jesus bears his own cross. There will be no Simon of Cyrene in John's account of the crucifixion. As Jesus said in the parable of the Good Shepherd, he lays down his life of his own accord, and he will take it up again. This is just another detail showing how Jesus is the one in charge throughout this entire narrative. Second, it's not the cross that's carried. Rather, it's the crossbeam. The uprights were stationary in the place of crucifixion. The condemned carried the crossbeam on the back of his neck, with his arms wrapped around it. A very precarious situation for walking, especially walking in the narrow streets of Jerusalem. Then, after mentioning the place of crucifixion as the place of the skull, or Golgotha, they simply describe the act. They crucified him with two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. The placement of Jesus vis-a-vis the other two makes them appear to be a royal retinue as set forth by Donald Sr., or from his position in the middle, he's already drawing people to himself when he's been lifted up, as surmised by Thomas Brodie. Just outside the convent of the Sisters of Zion is a courtyard, around which are several chapels connected with the events described above. First, there's the Chapel of the Condemnation, pictured here. Note Jesus receiving his cross as he begins the Via Dolorosa. Outside on the street is a marker commemorating the first station where Jesus receives his cross. A little way further is the chapel of the second station, which is pictured here. It commemorates Jesus carrying his cross. One of the things that pilgrims do when in Jerusalem is walk the Via Dolorosa. That's what's depicted here. You can see that at the front is a pilgrim carrying a cross. That can be a powerful experience, but at the same time, many detract from it by offering to take photos. This picture gives an idea of the width of the streets. These are the 21st century streets. In Jesus' day, they were more than likely a lot narrower than this. After the Via Dolorosa moves toward the Holy Sepulchre, it begins to rise in elevation, which is shown by the steps in this photograph, taken near the spot commemorating the sixth station. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. After all, Golgotha was a hill. The end of the Via Dolorosa is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, whose entrance is depicted here. This final picture is taken from the roof of a nearby building, and it shows the two rather massive domes of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That church commemorates the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Well, this is about all the time we have in this session. We'll have to leave the events of the Holy Sepulchre to the next session. See you then.